historical subject, so I really hope you do too. Alright. Over 100 years after the RMS Titanic met its demise on April 15th, 1912, the story of the tragic wreck through Titanic survivor accounts continues to haunt and mesmerize people worldwide. Out of over 2,200 passengers, approximately only 700 people survived to share their stories. Many Titanic survivor stories have been lost to the passages of time. Some survivors were hesitant to share the quite harrowing details of this experience, never speaking publicly about the sinking of the Titanic. Others went on to share their stories and their rescue stories through interviews, memoirs, and speaking engagements. These first-hand accounts talk about the chaos, anxiety, horror, the items that were lost, and the strange beauty of one of the most luxurious ocean liners that had ever been seen, sinking slowly into the water before them. In the wreck and its aftermath, families were torn apart, great loves were lost, and a tremendous amount of life was sacrificed. These accounts bring us back to that terrible and fateful night all those years ago. The first story is the Titanic Orphans. More so than any other survivors of the Titanic, Mitchell Marcel Navralty Jr. and his brother Edmund whipped up a media frenzy following the horrible events of April 15th, 1912. The two young boys spoke nothing but French and had no family present in their lifeboat. I was going to say with them and then in them, and I combined it. After a woman who spoke French took them to New York City, the boys became a national sensation. But who were they? Registered under false names, the Titanic Orphans had been kidnapped by their father, with plans to bring them to America for a new start. As the Titanic sank, their mother frantically searched for them in France. Finally, she recognized them from the media and traveled to the Big Apple to take them back to France, where they lived out the rest of their days. Edmund went on to become an architect and passed away following World War II. Mitchell lived until 2001, which made him the oldest male survivor of the Titanic disaster. That's kind of sad. If the father was stealing them and they hadn't been made famous by this disaster, their mother might never have found them. That's sad. Molly Brown, an American socialite whose husband had struck it rich in the mining business. Molly Brown was known for her flashy hats and charming personality. While she enjoyed her wealth, she spent her life giving back, advocating for the rights of women and children and the importance of education. Although she was known as Maggie by those closest to her, after her death the world would know her as the unsinkable Molly Brown for her reported bravery amid the Titanic disaster. According to various stories, Molly helped board survivors into lifeboats during the evacuation, and later helped steer her own lifeboat number 6. Brown, portrayed by Kathy Bates in the 1997 movie, was said to have argued with the quartermaster to return to the debris to find more survivors, and that she even threatened to throw him and his crew overboard if they didn't go back. was supposed to play that part, but something happened with the filming and her schedule did not line up, and she would have had to cancel a bunch of concert dates. And I have to wonder how different it would have been with her instead of Kathy Bates. I love Kathy Bates, but I like Reba as well. What do you think? Tell me down below. The next story is Charles Light-Toller. Charles Light-Toller was a British naval officer working as second officer aboard the Titanic, and he should have been dead after he went down with the ship. After ushering as many women and children onto lifeboats as he could, Light-Toller attempted to swim away from the Titanic as it plunged into the Atlantic. But the sinking ship created a vacuum in the ocean that dragged him underwater. Minutes away from drowning, a boiler exploded beneath the waves and blew him right out of the water. It's a good thing, too. On May 31st, 1940, the Royal Navy sent the then 66-year-old officer to Dunkirk to rescue stranded members of the Allied forces, and he returned home with 130 men shoved into his small boat. I did not know that somebody lived through getting sucked under. We talked about it in my last video, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. J. Bruce Ismay. As the highest-ranked official of the White Star Line, English businessman J. Bruce Ismay jumped into a collapsible sea, the last and ninth lifeboat that was lowered into the Atlantic before the Titanic sunk just 20 minutes later. And for the remainder of his life, he paid for it. The American press crucified Ismay, calling him J. Brute Ismay and coward of the Titanic. Stories circulated that he was to blame for the sinking, having purportedly pushed the ship's crew to increase Titanic's speed to get ahead of their scheduled arrival and garner positive press. However, this exchange was considered unlikely to have happened, and the scathing criticism against him in America was most likely due to his falling out with newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst prior to the tragedy of the Titanic. Despite an official British investigation affirming Ismay's defense that he only boarded the last lifeboat after all available women and children were boarded, London society also rejected him, and he lived out his life being seen as a coward. Still, Ismay, played by Jonathan Hyde in the 1997 movie, didn't shirk his responsibilities. He spent the rest of his life paying out insurance claims to family members who lost loved ones on the Titanic. And his family today insists that he was unfairly persecuted. Cosmo and Lucy Duff Gordon. Like Ismay, high society British couple Sir Cosmo and Lucy Lady Duff Gordon gained notoriety for surviving the Titanic. The first-class couple was some of the first people to get on lifeboat number 1. Lady Duff Gordon was a prominent British fashion designer, and she described her memories of her experience. Quote, "Everyone seemed to be rushing for that boat. A few men who crowded in were turned back at the point of Captain Smith's revolver, and several of them were felled before order was restored. I recall being pushed towards one of the boats and being helped in." End quote. Can you imagine? You're trying to live and they're shooting you down. Like, I cannot. Thanks to the American press, Cosmo was attacked for not abiding by the women and children first policy, but the wealthy landowner claimed there were no women and children to be seen when the boat was set into the water. He was also malaligned for giving the crewmen on his lifeboat money. Some reports Lucille Carter. Remember that fancy car scene where Kate and Leo get steamy, literally, in the 1997 movie of the Titanic? It was based on the one owned by Lucille Carter and her family, the car, all of whom were passengers on the ship. Carter initially spun a harrowing yarn for the media about her husband rushing her and her children to the lifeboats before joining the other men. But in her divorce papers, she revealed her husband had told her the ship was sinking, and then he had just left. She made it to a lifeboat with her children on her own, but later bumped into him on the Carpathia, where he was just as surprised as she was. He literally told her he thought she would never make it off the Titanic. Okay. Sir. I couldn't believe that. Violet Jessup. The sinking of the Titanic was not Violet Jessup's first rodeo, as far as boating accidents were concerned anyway. That was the collision of the RMS Olympic, where she was working as a stewardess, and the HMS Hawk. Thankfully, both managed to stay afloat after the British warship ripped a hole in the ocean liner. But within the year, Jessup was experiencing another disaster. As the Titanic went down, the Argentinian native helped confused Spanish-speaking women and children escape before she was ordered to hop into Lifeboat 16, where she was handed a baby to take care of as she floated away. And I know what you're thinking, but after she was rescued by the Carpathia, she didn't give up on sea life. Miss Unsinkable was working on the HMHS Britannic when it was struck by a mine on November 12, 1916, and she once again escaped with her life. She continued to work until her retirement in 1950 and passed away on dry land in 1971. Frederick Fleet. Frederick was a 24-year-old sailor who had worked his way up to look out for the Titanic in 1912. Supposedly, he was the guy who actually saw the iceberg, and he was at the end of his shift, and he called out for anyone that could hear him to steer away. After the collision, he was tasked with rowing Lifeboat 6 and brought its passengers to the Carpathia. Although Fleet survived, his remaining years were less than happy. He was plagued by survivor's guilt, and he died of suicide in January of 1965, just 2 weeks after his wife died, during what must have been a particularly difficult Christmas season. Noelle Leslie. Now, you might not think that a wealthy countess would be among those pushing up their sleeves to save passengers aboard the Titanic, but that's exactly what Noelle did. As the ship went down, she manned the tiller on Lifeboat 8 and took its helm for more than an hour. Upon returning to shore, Leslie stayed out of the public eye and did her best to lead a quiet life. The one Titanic contact she kept was that of Tom Jones, a crewman who was in charge of her lifeboat, with whom she maintained regular correspondence with until her death in 1956. Masabumi Hasano. Hasano was working for Japan's Ministry of Transportation on board the Titanic when he woke up to the sounds of chaos outside his cabin and ran up to the deck like everyone else. He was initially denied a space in the lifeboats because of his ethnicity, but he hopped in another boat that had space for 2 more passengers. At first, he was celebrated along with the rest of the survivors, but the media soon chided him for supposedly bucking the women and children first policy of a maritime disaster. And good old rescue ship, he got back to work and helped the radio men send messages from his fellow survivors. Oh, I'm so sorry. Milvina Dean. When the Titanic went down in 1912, Milvina Dean was only 2 months old. The Dean family had initially booked steerage on another ship, but in a twist of fate, in the form of a strike on board that boat, forced them onto the Titanic. As third-class passengers, the family should have been done for, but Dean's father happened to be on the deck at the time of the ship's collision with that blasted iceberg, and brought his family up to make sure they were at the front of the line for the lifeboats. Dean and her mother made it out, but her father did not. The two returned to England, and she lived for another 93 years, becoming the last living survivor of the Titanic. After she passed away in 2009, her ashes were scattered at a Southampton dock, where the Titanic set sail. So, those are all of the survivor stories I have for you. So, it doesn't look like this video is very long, so I'm going to go ahead and include the ghost stories, which is a little bit shorter than what I just read to you, but I think you'll enjoy it just as much. Alright. I'm just going to give it straight to you from the intro that I wrote and everything. The RMS Titanic set out on its maiden voyage with more than 2,200 passengers aboard. Tragically, only 706 passengers would survive. The ship was moving too fast one freezing night, struck an iceberg, and went down. Those who perished in the event suffered a terrifying and agonizing demise. Any paranormal enthusiast will tell you that strong emotions paired with an untimely end are key ingredients in most hauntings. For 8 decades, the RMS Titanic and all its contents sat at the bottom of the Atlantic until underwater excavation teams brought artifacts back to the surface. And now these pieces of history are offering a rare glimpse as to what it was to be like on that massive ship, and hints of the ghostly spirits that still linger around the doomed vessel. The pieces displayed apparently still have connections to their former passengers who possessed them. Stick with me, I'll tell you all about it. A lady in black appears on the grand staircase. The Titanic Artifact exhibition at the Luxor Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas apparently has a ghost that wanders its grand staircase. Employees and guests alike have seen this mysterious woman who wears a black period dress with a white collar and her hair in a bun. As a photographer prepped for the opening of the exhibition, he spotted the woman casually walking down the grand staircase. He was startled as he hadn't seen anyone enter and the staircase was roped off. He assumed she was part of the exhibit and asked if she'd like him to photograph her. She ignored him. He went back to setting up, but suddenly she was directly behind him. Again, he offered to photograph her, and this time, she didn't just ignore him. She vanished. The next story is also at the Luxor. The exhibit at the Luxor includes a portrait of J. Bruce Ismay, one of the Titanic's builders. We just talked about him. He apparently fled the sinking ship, leaving women and children behind. Witnesses on the lifeboats claim that he kept his back to the ship as it descended, and allegedly he was one of the ones insisting that the ship speed up after receiving ice warnings. Perhaps it's not that surprising that the ghosts of the Titanic have taken a dislike to him. passenger. The British man was very soft-spoken and extremely interested in every detail of the vessel, almost unusually so. Bishop found this man to be a bit strange, not unpleasant, just odd. It wasn't until a few years later, after seeing a photo of Titanic Captain Edward John Smith, that Bishop realized why the situation felt so off. He exclaimed to a friend, "I know him. I gave him a tour of my boat." The friend laughed and informed Bishop that this man had long since been deceased. That man was the captain of the Titanic. People aboard ships passing the site where the RMS Titanic went down have reported mysterious balls of light believed to be spirit orbs hovering in the area. On more than one occasion, submarines traveling those depths have received unusual radio interference, odd noises, and SOS calls with no origin crackle through their communication equipment. In Branson, Missouri, there is a Titanic exhibit, and while visiting family in Missouri, a teenager went to this traveling exhibit and had a brush with the paranormal. After posting on yourghoststories.com, she recounts the experience. She said, "We were walking through the hallway to get to the artifacts, and I was behind everyone. I suddenly felt a soft tug at the back of my t-shirt. I quickly turned around to see who the culprit was, but the hallway was absolutely empty. I quickly faced forward again to catch a potential trickster, but no one was sneaking away, and everyone in front of me was far ahead." Okay. The next one is a legend. A creepy legend surrounding the Titanic comes from the deathbed of a young Scottish girl named Jessie. On the same night that the ship went down, Jessie was on the verge of dying. In her delirious state, she supposedly spoke of a massive sinking ship and a man named Wally playing the fiddle. She had no way of knowing that the Titanic would sink that night, or that Wally Hartley played his violin one last time as he and his band went down with the ship. Morgan Robertson published The Wreck of the Titan in 1898. 14 years later, the real-life Titanic disaster happened. Many people took that as a sign that the author had precognitive abilities. Robertson rejected those claims, saying he was just drawing on his real-life experiences as a seaman. However, there are plenty of chillingly specific parallels between the book and reality. Besides the similar names, the fictitious Titan, like the Titanic, was supposed to be the largest of its kind and an unsinkable ship. It also lacked enough lifeboats to accommodate its passenger load and struck an iceberg while going too fast in the North Atlantic. Both disasters took place in April and cost thousands of people their lives. That's pretty creepy if you ask me. I'm just trying to make sure. Okay. Frederick Fleet, as we talked about earlier, a British sailor who served as the lookout, spotted the iceberg and warned the bridge. After his wife's passing, just after Christmas, he was evicted by his brother-in-law and committed suicide, as we talked about. His grave went unmarked until the Titanic Historical Society erected a headstone for him in 1993. So from 1964 to 1993, unmarked. And it appears that his spirit is not quite at rest, however. Witnesses have claimed to see him keeping watch over the Las Vegas exhibition on their promenade deck, perhaps driven by his guilt to keep watch, even in the afterlife. According to staff and visitors, the Titanic artifact exhibition at the Luxor is extremely haunted. Eerie sounds, uneasy feelings, actual sightings of ghosts. Artifacts expert Joe Zimmer seems to attract quite a bit of attention from these supposed ghosts. He says he's had his name called, his hair and clothing tucked on, all of these followed by sounds of laughter. And late at night, he reports hearing a phantom which is gonna creep me out later. Okay. Where was I? I was distracted by a spider. Okay. The Georgia Aquarium also houses potentially haunted artifacts from the Titanic. The employees have claimed to see shadows, hear voices, and even be touched by the spirits. The paranormal activity is so intense that the Sci-Fi Channel's Ghost Hunters came in to investigate. They reportedly captured a recording of a voice saying, "No, please wait," in the iceberg room. The team also said they got readings of several anomalous cold spots and witnessed a shadowy figure. After reviewing their findings, they concluded that the Titanic exhibit at the Georgia Aquarium is in fact haunted. I wonder if that one's still there. I'd love to go see it. I went to the one in Branson ages ago. A comforting spirit haunts the Titanic Belfast Museum. As they like to say in Ireland, the Titanic was built by the Irish and sunk by the English. The Titanic Belfast Museum commemorates the ship in Belfast, Ireland, and also seems to have a ghostly presence of its own. In 2009, a woman touring the museum listened to the final distress call of the RMS Titanic. She described the events that followed in a letter to the hosts of the podcast Real Ghost Stories Online. She claimed that while hearing the original Morse code and seeing the words of the RMS Titanic's distress call, she became emotionally, overwhelmed. Her heart was pounding. She felt anxious and heartbroken, like she was the radio controller herself. She started shaking, got sick to her stomach, and she started to cry. Walking away to get some air, she felt a hand on her shoulder and heard a male voice say softly, "It's okay." She assumed it was her friend, and she reached up to brush his hand, but realized there was no one there. Was it the spirit of radio controller Jack Phillips? She wonders. Was he reassuring her that he was at peace with what happened? And finally, Captain Smith. According to Louise and Neil Bonner, owners of the former home of the Titanic captain, Edward John Smith, the shipmaster still lingers in his house. The couple have spent the last decade renting the 19th century Victorian, and their tenants have reported feeling icy chills passing through them, hearing strange noises, and even seeing full-bodied apparitions of Captain Smith. The property has also suffered a flood in the kitchen and unusually cold gusts in the dining room. According to Mr. Bonner, he said, "Some years ago we had a single chap living there, and he rang up one day convinced he'd seen the ghost of the captain. He was in bed when he saw him drift across the room." So creepy. Anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me today. I really hope you enjoyed this video just as much as you enjoyed the first one. I had a lot of fun researching it, and I'm all about the paranormal, so hopefully it was kind of a halfway to Halloween moment for you. I'm a little late, but I have plans for that as well. It's ready, I just haven't found time to film it. Most of you know my mother has dementia, and she needs full-time care, so my brother and my sister and I are splitting it, and it definitely takes a lot of what time I have when I'm not at work. So thank you for being patient with me. Hopefully things will level out here soon, and I'll be able to start putting 2 videos out a week plus Patreon. They'll be getting this video as early access, so I don't know exactly when y'all will see it, but stuff is coming. I promise. I do have plans for this channel. I have not forgotten about you. I'm determined to make it to like 10,000 subscribers. I don't know why that's my goal. Almost at 6. I'm gonna get there. So if you like content from me and you want to see extra, check out Patreon. Like I said, they get early access, they get rambles, they get reading to you videos, and just random stuff that I don't necessarily post on my channel. Also,